Such good things, starting the year fresh. I don't know about you, but for me, it's exciting to start with with the pause plan. It's exciting for fresh beginnings, like Brandon was talking about earlier. I got a new journal. I'm kind of excited about that. I keep track of the things that God tells me in the process of the year. So I like to write them down, and I like to share them with you because I want you to see how accessible Jesus is. He is right here with us, and he has things he wants to share with us, even this morning. And one of the things that people always ask, and they're so kind that they would even ask, but they always ask, how do you hear from God? And that especially happens like this week, like at the beginning of the year, where we really want to press in and we want to hear from God, but that's not actually what they're asking. What they're actually asking is, how can I hear from God? Because I'm hungry. I want to hear from him. I want to hear his voice. And that's a big question. And there's lots of answers to that because God speaks to his children in so many ways. But one of the ways he does it is through his word. And I felt like this week was really interesting to me because I felt like the Lord, as I sat down and started my devotions in the new year, I felt like he spoke something specific to me, and I wondered if it was something that would be relatable to you as well. So in addition to sharing what he shared with me, I want to walk you through my process. I want to walk you through how I hear Jesus. So if you will, come with me to my living room for a second, because that's where I spend time with Jesus. Most mornings, I get up about an hour before anybody else does. It's quiet. Nobody's bothering me. More than that, nobody's distracting me. And I open my Bible, and I go just directly to the pause plan, which is on our website, and we talked about that earlier. And I actually think this is just a really good time for us to kind of think, how would I do that? So I go to it, and this actually started for me on Thursday morning, which was January 2nd. So yes, I was already behind in my reading plan, just so you know. And I want you to know you can cut yourself some slack with that. It's not that I don't do this. In fact, I do this every day. But January 1st, I got up and watched the parade just like you did. And it was okay. And now there are some people who would go, okay, now I've got two days of reading and I need to check it off on the box. And you, if that's you, you go ahead. I'm a very task-oriented person, so that's natural for me to do something like that. I usually don't. I usually recognize that I want to just have a relationship with Jesus. And so I sit down and I read that day's scriptures. And that particular day, I seemed to have a little bit more time. I felt comfortable, and I actually sat down and went, I'm going to read 1 and 2. So I opened to Luke, and I'm going to invite you to open to Luke 1 now. And I'm just going to go through this with you. I opened it up, and I quickly realized that this story about Zechariah's unbelief and then followed by his obedience was a really important thing for us to grasp as we start a new year. So while we all know that Luke 2 is the account of the birth of Jesus, and we've celebrated that well in the last month, and really great stuff, but Luke 1 begins with Zechariah. It tells us the beginning and the arrival of John the Baptist, beginning with his parents, Zechariah and Elizabeth. Now, Zechariah was a priest, and it tells us at the beginning of this chapter that Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous before God, and they were childless. In a time where being childless made people wonder if you were making a mistake in some way. But that wasn't their reality. It tells us very specifically they were righteous before God and they were childless. Both of those things are important. When it became his turn to go to the temple and burn incense, he did. And the angel of the Lord spoke to him. We're now in Luke 1. Let's start at verse 11. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zacharias saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zachariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord." And it goes on, and the angel continues to tell him very specific, powerful things about this son that's going to come. Big stuff for a dad who's childless to get his head around. Really big stuff. Go on to verse 18. Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years." The angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I've been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Zechariah doubted Gabriel, and because of his unbelief, he was silenced. He lost his voice for months, not just the scratchy voice. He couldn't talk. But that's not what I wrote in my journal. So my journal, I always sit with my Bible, my journal, my cup of coffee, my dog. It's a thing. We come together, we sit down with Jesus, and we have a good time. And I sat there, and it wasn't the disobedience that I noted in my journal. What I wrote was, even in his unbelief, Gabriel still told him the miracle was going to happen in God's time. That was really comforting to me. This idea that he didn't disqualify himself. He didn't believe. He was confused. But he didn't disqualify himself. God still intended to do the miracle. Okay, so check this out. One of the things I love about the Bible is how this ancient word is so relevant and parallel to the stories that we're walking out in our lives. So here's this guy and his wife, similar to you, sitting here in this service right now. They're living a faithful life. They're faithful to God, yet they're living a life of quiet disappointment. They show up for church. They do the things they're supposed to do. They do the things they're told to do by the Lord. They're faithful. Yet they're living this life of quiet disappointment. They have unfulfilled dreams. You don't have to raise your hand, but you got any? I do. Unfulfilled dreams. Faithful with underlying pain. I sat there with my journal with a few tears, recognizing we all live there. We all live with some pain. It might be your foot. It might be an emotional pain. And I sat there confessing to the Lord, because that's what I do in my journal. I write him a letter. Confessing to the Lord, while I know I live my life faithfully before you, I know I do. I also recognize that my pain and my disappointment can become a block to me seeing and receiving your miracles. I can't always see it because I have this block of this pain, and it may be something that, man, I keep way under the surface. Most of the time, nobody knows it's going on. Sometimes it comes up. Sometimes they're very aware that we're walking in that pain. And I wonder how many of us are living our lives like Zachariah and Elizabeth. We choose to live faithfully before the Lord, and he is delighted that we do. And then somehow in our acceptance of what we can't change, which we have to do, that's part of our process, we accept so much that we put up a block and we can't even see the miracle when it's coming because it doesn't look like what we expected. He was old and his wife was old, and they didn't expect God to answer this way at this point. Verse 6 of this first chapter of Luke tells us straight up, they were both righteous in God's eyes and they were blameless people. Yet when his messenger came to them with the truth of their miracle, there was no place for belief. I sat there with my Bible and my journal open, and I realized just how easy it is to grow weary in the waiting. See, God's made promises to us, and we start doubting them, and we get a little exhausted in the process. And sometimes in the middle of our faith-filled lives, faith-filled people, we shut off the miracles. We silence ourselves from the things that God has planned for us. And while Zechariah had a moment of unbelief that literally closed his mouth for months, God wasn't done with him. He didn't disqualify him. The promise was still there for him. It's still there for us. See, this word speaks to me in my place of unbelief, in my place of discouragement, in my place of disappointment. I gotta read this word because he can speak to me through it. And he wants to speak to you through it too. See, that disappointment, it was real. But God had a really important requirement for Zechariah in the middle of that. Go with me to the end of the chapter. Not really the end of the chapter, it's a long chapter. Verse 59, when John the Baptist was born. So the child is born, dad can't talk all this time. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "There's no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to the father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately, his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. See, Zechariah had to speak the word of the Lord, walking in his God-given authority. Now, make no mistake, Elizabeth had already told them what the name was to be. See, he may not have been able to talk for months, but this was a couple who communicated. They knew that their God had given them a promise, that their God had told them their child was coming. They knew that she was pregnant. They knew that he was coming. They knew what his name was to be, and they were going to walk it out faithfully because that's who they were. It didn't matter that nobody was listening. What mattered was that Zechariah had to step up and he had to speak out because he had to walk in his God-given authority. And we do too. There are things that you have authority over in your family, in your place of work, in your sphere of influence. You have been given God-given authority. And there are things that you have to step up and speak out. And as you do, you make space for that miracle to happen in those places. See, there are things that only get set in motion as we step up and do what God's called us to do. as we speak out and we recognize there is truth to be spoken into these situations, and truth spoken in love. I'm not talking about ripping on people. I am talking about owning it, knowing God has said it, and I will speak it. I have faith to believe. See, I may not be able to see that miracle, but I'm not going to stand in silence and not speak it. I'm going to believe it until it begins to happen. And I'm going to speak it forth because God's put it within me, and I have a place in this process. I have to speak forth. I've got to do what God has called me to do. So back in our stories, in our waiting, maybe we've gone silent. Maybe we don't talk about that unrealized dream anymore. Maybe we don't even let ourselves think about it anymore. Maybe it's time to stand up and to speak out and trust God with the rest of it. He's got it. So I have two encouragements for you as we start this 21 days of prayer and the Word. Give God a chance to speak to you in the middle of His Word. He's there and He desires. He wants to speak directly to your circumstance through His Word. Expect Him to do it and give Him space to do so. And like Zechariah, if you, in your walk of faithfulness, have found yourself doubting, we're going to do some letter writing in a little bit. Tell the Lord about it. Confess to Him. And start speaking. Because He's put a word in your mouth and He will fill it. Amen.